Machine translation is getting pretty good. Since 2016, a new automatic translation paradigm emerged based on artificial neural networks, neural machine translation, or NMT. According to the press releases of the major MT developers, NMT systems reach dream human levels. Some papers even dare to talk about human parity. If MT quality is that good, does it increase the working speed of translators then? Industry results seem to indicate it does. Some companies report significant time gains when post-editing MT output compared to when translating from scratch. Autodesk, for instance, reported an increase in productivity of 37 to 92%, depending on the language combination. There are several issues with all the claims I just mentioned. The first issue is that there is no standard way of determining translation quality. Human parity has thus to be taken with a grain of salt. The second issue is that the huge productivity claims are based on studies carried out in experimental conditions. And the third issue is that the voices of professional translators are often neglected.
We tried to address some of these issues and collaborated with DGT, the Directorate-General for Translation. We collected XLIF documents from 20 professional translators while they carried out real translation tasks in normal working conditions. We only minimally interfered with their translation workflow and asked the participants to enable machine translation only for half of the segments in each document they worked on. When comparing post-editing to translating from scratch, even though we observed an increase in productivity for most of the translators, this increase was much smaller compared to the findings of similar studies which were carried out in experimental conditions. Moreover, the net effect of MT on the overall translation workflow was low, as post-editing MT output represented only a small portion of the daily tasks of a translator at the DGT.
We believe that the studies as the one we carried out with DGT are important, as they reveal a more nuanced picture. As with all technological advancements, it is crucial to set correct expectations.
If you want to know more, come and listen to our talk at Research at the Movies on May 11th, watch the recording of last year's jump cut presentation at the LT3 Research YouTube channel, or read the full research paper.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction. I'm Arda Tezcan, and I'm going to start presenting a study that we carried out with the European Commission on measuring the effect of machine translation on the translation workflow. I'm going to start with the presentation and leave the floor to Lieve for the second part. Okay. So, in fact, there are many scientific studies already in literature that investigate the impact of machine translation on productivity of translators. But most of these studies have been carried out in experimental conditions and not in real life professional translation environments. So before this study, the big question to us was, can we actually measure the impact of machine translation on the production workflow? And in other words, do the translators work faster with machine translation when working on real translation tasks in normal working conditions? So in experimental settings, we can of course control for many factors. We can, for example, prepare a data set with specific types of segments. We can ask the translators to use specific tools, and they are not performing these tasks usually with strict time constraints. But this is of course very different to what happens in the real world, as in this case, we cannot constrain the way translators work, and we should also anticipate all the unexpected factors that can contribute, in fact, to our findings. So when we thought about collecting data for this study, we wanted actually translators to work in a way which was as natural as possible. So without using any specific tools or doing anything outside of their daily routines. So we minimally interfered with their translation workflow, and we decided to work with the STL XLIF files that were generated during the translation task when they used STL Trados. The only thing then we asked from the translators was to switch machine translation on for the half of each document they worked on. Maybe I should also mention at this point that the machine translation was used for segments for which high fuzzy matches could not be found at the DGT. So for these segments, when they worked with MT on the first half of a document, they would then use the switch on the second half of the next document. So they would enable and disable the MT switch for a different half of each consecutive documents they worked on. We had 20 participants in total for this study, 12 translators from the French language department at the DGT, who used a statistical machine translation engine developed by the European Commission, and 8 translators from the Finnish language department who used a neural machine translation engine. They were all experienced users of machine translation, and we collected data from these participants over a period of 1 month at the end of 2018. And during this period, the translators were assigned to translation tasks and documents as usual, and they also had strict deadlines that they had to meet. We were particularly interested in 3 things: the processing speed when the translators worked with or without machine translation. We were also interested in the relationship between the processing speed and the amount of editing they did during post-editing of the MT output. And finally, we were also interested in how the translators perceived the usability of machine translation. So we also prepared a survey and sent out to the participating translators, and Liva will give more details on this. So when we started analyzing the SDL-XLIF files, we started with a really straightforward measurement. We measured processing speed per token. And in this example, let's say the English segment was translated into French in around 264 seconds in total. And we divided this number by the number of tokens in the source sentence, in this case 22, and ended up with, let's say, at 12 seconds per token as processing speed for this segment. So in this case, larger values mean that the translators needed more time to complete the translation, which means that they were slower. So while this is a very straightforward calculation, the SDL-XLIF files actually made this very difficult for us because we could find a clear timestamp in these files for when a segment was edited or closed, but not for when it was opened. And because of also other reasons that we encountered or other issues, we had to actually filter out a lot of segments out of our data, around 70% of the segments. And the main reasons were, again, non-sequential translations or editings, for which we couldn't then calculate reliable processing speeds. We also just didn't have some metadata in certain cases, and some of these calculated values were just outliers. So even though this was really annoying for us, we still ended up around 16,000 words to analyze from the French translators, and around 16,000 words from the Finnish translators, which were still large data sets compared to similar studies. So the simple question was, does machine translation speed up the translator's work? And the basic answer here was yes. When we looked at the average processing speeds for both language departments, on average, translators worked, in fact, faster when they post-edited machine translation output compared to translating from scratch. The improvements were around, in this case, 12% for the French department and 14% for the translators at the Finnish department. So the interesting thing here was that these values are, in fact, much lower than the values reported in similar studies, again, which were conducted or carried out in experimental conditions. And again, it shows us that it was really important to repeat or do a similar study in this very specific production environment. Besides looking at these main averages, we also made a distinction between the 2 types of MT suggestions. So an MT output was either edited or corrected to achieve a correct translation by the translators, or they were also just sometimes accepted because they were already perfect translations. So what we wanted to see here is also that how long did it actually take for the translators to approve these perfect translations? And it was actually quite interesting to see that they indeed needed a considerable amount of time to even just control and check that the translation was perfect. And this was around already 3 seconds per token for the French translators, and around 2 seconds per token again for the Finnish translators. This was interesting in another way because it also showed us a kind of an upper boundary for the usefulness of integrating machine translation, at least for these translators at the DGT. So besides looking at the averages, we also looked into individual processing speeds. And when we look at the results for these 5 different translators from the French department, the first thing we see here is that there is in fact a huge variation between these results. And this is already maybe something that's completely not unexpected. But on top of that, while we saw that on average the translators were faster when they used MT, this was not the case for all participants. So if you look at the translator G and L in this chart, here we see, for example, that these 2 translators worked faster, in fact, when they translated from scratch instead of post-editing MT output. When we looked at the results for the Finnish translators, the first thing here, again, we see was that the results, we didn't see such a huge difference, let's say, between the translators. Moreover, then all translators in this case worked faster with MT, gaining also similar amounts of speed when they worked with machine translation. So, of course, between the individual differences and the differences in languages, we also expect this result or this difference between the 2 language departments also to be because of the different types of machine translation engines they actually used. And they used, for example, in this case, a neural machine translation engine at the Finnish department, which is, let's say, a more recent MT architecture. So I'm going to leave the floor to Lieve, who will take over and explain the second part, or talk about the second part of the presentation.
Okay. Yeah, as translation is not only about productivity, as Arde already mentioned, we set up a survey to ask the opinion of the DGT participants, and this helped us to interpret the numbers. We asked 3 types of questions. The first dealt with translation speed, the second with preference, so do DGT translators prefer working with or without MT, and the third one dealt with quality. We don't have too much time today, so I will only summarize the answers to the second question in a minute. DGT translators mentioned several benefits, so reasons why they prefer working with MT, and the top 1 benefit is that it reduces typing efforts. But it can also help deciphering an original, it sometimes gives good suggestions, it definitely reduces dictionary lookup, but they also mentioned that the probability of leaving out some elements so that you forget to translate some parts decreases, and the probability of using correct terminology increases, so it gives some help to terminology as well. Also important and interesting is that they also mentioned some psychological benefits, which most probably are very personal, but people really liked that they didn't have to start from scratch or didn't have the feeling of not working alone. And they really gave us very honest answers, and I really want to show you 2 quotes or 2 answers. So one participant said, okay, I prefer working with MT because I'm lazy, and when I see that the segments are already filled, it gives me the impression that the work is already partly done. It's also out of habit, and granted, there's also less typing to do with MT. Or another participant answered like this: I also like the feeling that I'm not working alone, even if it's just a silly machine that is there to help me. There were, of course, also drawbacks. Most of the drawbacks were related to machine translation quality, and the answers confirm more or less what we already know about MT quality. Especially for neural machine translation, you often get very fluent translations, but they can be inaccurate. There is an issue with terminology, so sometimes it helps, but sometimes it's also wrong terminology, so you really have to be careful as a translator to check the terminology. Sometimes the MT produces complete nonsense, but this is probably less of an issue because it's more obvious that you have to translate from scratch then. What's more an issue is that MT does not always recognize the style and register needed. So it's trained on a huge translation memories, but it doesn't always match completely with the requirements you have when you translate the text. Some translators also mentioned that they can become less attentive and that they're not critical enough if they work with machine translation. So overall summary of this study, Arda didn't mention it, but we were contacted by DGT, by Daniel Prue, who's the manager, is kind of in between the MT developers and the translators. And they were really interested in this study because, yeah, management also hears all these numbers that you have huge productivity gains, and he really wanted to have a clear answer. So the answer is yes, it does speed up translation work, at least for most of the translators, but the average speed gains, as Arne mentioned, were much lower than what we read in studies. The results were more consistent for Finnish, but there they were working with dual machine translation than for French. In French, there were also some translators who were slowed down by using MT. Of course, we only worked on a very limited subset of the data. Arda already mentioned we had to throw out a lot of data, but maybe what's more important is that we only worked on a limited subset of the real tasks. So we only compared the segments that were translated by using machine translation with those segments that were translated from scratch. But of course, translators also translate based on translation memory matches. They do initial reading, they do a global revision, and all these tasks were not taken into account. So in that respect, those 12 to 14% time gain is probably much lower if you take all the other tasks into consideration as well. Of course, the study was carried out in a period when there were no extremely tight deadlines. So these were the normal working conditions. Maybe under extreme circumstances, this 12 to 14 speed gain might be on a low side. So yeah, it's a bit of a balance. Arda already mentioned, yeah, that the speed gain we saw that you have an upper limit. So approving perfect machine translation suggestions also takes time, and especially in the context of DGT, where you really want very high quality translations, the translator is really putting a stamp. It's approved, so it takes time, and if you look at it, it was 1/3 of the time that you need to translate from scratch for Finnish, and half of the time when you translate into French by using the statistical system. The numbers we report here, they can of course vary a lot depending on the type of text, and they cannot probably be transferred as such to other organizations. DGT has its own machine translation system. It's trained on own data. They have huge translation memories. It's a very specific type of text they translate. It's very formal language, a lot of repetitions. So yeah, you have to take this into account when you look at these numbers. Apart from the MT quality, it also varies a lot, I think, depending on the characteristics of the source texts. So if the source text is not well written, it also takes longer. The technical complexity, so there are a lot of factors to take into account. So to conclude, yes, there are benefits when you look at speed, but they were not huge, but they were there. And moreover, the participants, at least the participants who participated in our study, they really liked working with MT, and especially with dual machine translation, quality improved a lot. It is really a big step forward, so they were really happy working with it.